It wasn't the roar of the gun that made the German veterans freeze. It was the sound of the tracks. The men of the Wehrmacht were conquerors. They had swept across Poland in weeks. They had shattered the French army, the supposed greatest land force in Europe, in mere days. They had marched through the streets of Paris, invincible, untouchable, riding in their polished, precision-engineered Panzers. They believed no machine on earth could stop them. But out here, in the suffocating dust of the endless Russian steppes, the invincible German war machine was about to learn a terrifying lesson in arrogance. Out here, they would meet a weapon so utterly foreign to their understanding of warfare, so brutally effective that it would completely break the psychological dominance of the Third Reich. A machine they had mocked as primitive, a machine they had laughed at. And later in this story, you'll discover the one horrifying reality about how this weapon was actually operated, a secret that makes its devastating success almost impossible to comprehend. But to understand the sheer panic this machine caused, you have to understand the mindset of the German High Command in the summer of 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of human warfare. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border, spearheaded by the elite Panzer divisions. The German intelligence reports were clear, arrogant, and entirely dismissive. They told the troops that the Soviet army was a decaying structure. Just kick in the door, Hitler had promised, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. The German tank crews rode in their Panzerkampfwagen III and Panzerkampfwagen IV tanks. These were marvels of engineering. They had excellent radios, superb optics, and comfortable crew compartments. They were designed for the rapid, surgical strikes of Blitzkrieg. When they looked at the intelligence files on Soviet armor, they laughed. They expected to fight thin-skinned, obsolete light tanks, target practice. For the first few weeks, they were right. The border defenses melted away. The Soviet BT-7 and T-26 tanks were slaughtered by the thousands. The Germans were advancing so fast, their supply lines could barely keep up. Victory seemed absolute. But then, the reports coming back to Berlin began to change. They weren't reports of victory. They were frantic, desperate pleas for help. Near the city of Grodno, a German anti-tank unit dug in their 3.7-centimeter Pak-36 guns. These were the standard anti-tank weapons of the German army, highly effective in France and Poland. The gunners spotted a dust cloud on the horizon. A group of unknown, heavily angled Soviet tanks was approaching. The German commander waited calmly for the perfect range. At 400 meters, he gave the order to fire. The armor-piercing shell streaked across the field. It hit the lead Soviet tank dead center. And then, the impossible happened. The shell didn't penetrate. It didn't explode inside the crew compartment. It sparked, shattered, and simply bounced off into the sky. The German gunners stared in absolute disbelief. They reloaded. They fired again. 300 meters, 200 meters, another hit, another ricochet. It was like throwing pebbles at a concrete bunker. The unknown tank didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. It rotated its massive turret, leveled a massive 76.2 millimeter gun, and evaporated the German position in a single deafening blast. What they didn't know was that they had just met the Russian T-34 WW2 tank, and it was about to turn the Eastern Front into a slaughterhouse for the German army. Word of the encounter spread through the German ranks like a virus. Panic began to set in. The German infantry had a bitter, terrifying nickname for their useless 3.7-centimeter anti-tank guns. They stopped calling them weapons. They started calling them Herr's Anklappgerät, the army door knockers, because all they could do was knock on the armor of the T-34 and politely ask to come in. But what made the T-34 so utterly impervious to German fire? It wasn't just thick steel. It was a masterpiece of lethal geometry.
The front armor of the T-34 was sloped at a sharp 60-degree angle. This brilliant design meant that when a German shell struck the tank, it wasn't hitting a flat wall. The angle artificially doubled the effective thickness of the steel. Worse for the Germans, the slope was designed to physically deflect incoming projectiles, sending high-velocity armor-piercing rounds ricocheting harmlessly into the dirt. General Heinz Guderian, the legendary architect of the German Blitzkrieg, rushed to the front lines to see this monster for himself. When he arrived, his men were in a state of shock. A single T-34 had just driven straight through a German defensive line, crushing their anti-tank guns under its massive wide tracks, absorbing dozens of direct hits without a scratch before casually driving back to the Soviet lines. Guderian wrote back to Berlin with a chilling realization. The era of German tank superiority, he stated, was over. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The German engineers prided themselves on precision. Their tanks were like luxury sports cars, finely tuned, complex, and beautiful. The T-34 was the exact opposite. It was a brutal, ugly, unrefined slab of metal. The welding seams were rough, the metal was unpolished. To a German engineer, it looked like garbage. But the T-34 wasn't built for a showroom. It was built for the apocalypse. When the autumn rains arrived, the Russian dirt turned into the rasputitsa, the sea of mud. The heavy, narrow-tracked German panzers sank to their axles. They bogged down. They froze. They became stationary metal coffins. But the T-34, it had massive, wide tracks and a specialized Christie suspension. It didn't sink. It floated over the mud like a steel ghost. Furthermore, it was powered by the legendary V2-34 aluminum water-cooled diesel engine. While the German tanks ran on highly flammable gasoline, meaning one good hit could turn the crew into ash, the T-34's diesel engine was incredibly difficult to set on fire. The Wehrmacht was no longer fighting a military force. They were fighting the landscape itself, armed with a machine that belonged to it. If you're still here, what comes next will completely change how you view the men who fought inside these steel beasts. Because while the T-34 was an absolute nightmare for the Germans to fight, it was also a living hell for the Soviets to drive. The official propaganda reels showed smiling heroic Soviet tank crews charging into glorious battle. The reality was far worse. There was no comfort inside a T-34, none. There was no heater, meaning in the Russian winter the steel interior plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Skin would instantly freeze to the metal. The engine was so deafeningly loud that the crew couldn't even hear each other scream. But the most shocking fact of all, the transmission. The T-34's gearbox was so primitive, so incredibly heavy and unrefined, that the driver literally could not shift gears with his bare hands. When the tank needed to change speeds in the heat of combat, the driver had to take a massive iron sledgehammer and physically smash the gear lever into place. Imagine being under heavy artillery fire, surrounded by exploding panzers, and having to beat your own vehicle with a hammer just to make it move. And remember that promise about how they communicated? Early in the war, the Soviet Union didn't have the industrial capacity to put radios in every tank. Only the commander's tank had a radio. The rest of the platoon was completely deaf. To give orders in the middle of a chaotic, smoke-filled battlefield, the tank commander had to open his heavy steel hatch, stand up, exposing the upper half of his body to sniper fire, shrapnel, and machine guns, and wave brightly colored flags at the other tanks. It was suicidal, it was barbaric, and it worked. By 1943, the German High Command realized they were facing annihilation. The T-34 was appearing not in dozens, but in thousands. Entire cities behind the Ural Mountains, like Tankgrad, had been converted into massive, relentless factories. Women, children, and old men worked 24 hours a day in freezing conditions, churning out T-34s by the hour. As soon as the paint was dry, they were driven straight off the assembly line and into combat. Hitler panicked. He demanded new, massive tanks to counter the Soviet swarm. He ordered the creation of the Panzer and the legendary Tiger I. These were terrifying, heavily armored behemoths with massive 88mm guns capable of destroying a T-34 from a mile away. For a brief moment, the Germans thought they had reclaimed the upper hand. But the Soviet response was ruthless. They simply took the T-34, ripped off the turret, and bolted on a massive, heavily armored three-man turret with a devastating 85mm anti-aircraft gun. They called it the T-34-85, and they built 50,000 of them. The climax of this brutal mechanical war arrived in the summer of 1943 at a place called Kursk.
It was the largest tank battle in human history. Over 6,000 tanks clashed on the open plains. The sky turned black from the oily smoke of burning steel. The German Tigers picked off the Soviet tanks from a distance. But there were simply too many. The Soviet commanders knew the only way to kill a Tiger was to get close. They ordered their T-34 drivers to charge at maximum speed directly into the wall of German fire. It was a suicide charge. Hundreds of T-34s were blown apart, their turrets thrown 50 feet into the air. But the survivors closed the distance. They swarmed the heavy German tanks like angry hornets. They fired point-blank into the thinner side armor of the Tigers and Panthers. At those ranges, the battle devolved into a chaotic, blind knife fight in the smoke. Tanks rammed into each other at full speed, grinding metal against metal until one of them caught fire. By the end of the Battle of Kursk, the German armored offensive capability was permanently broken. They would never launch another major strategic offensive in the East. The machine they had laughed at had broken the spine of the Third Reich. From Kursk, the T-34s simply did not stop. They ground their wide tracks over the frozen earth of Ukraine, through the forests of Poland, and finally into the shattered, burning streets of Berlin itself. There were 84,000 T-34 tanks built during the war. It is a number so large it defies comprehension. Almost 45,000 of them were destroyed. The Soviet Union paid for its victory with rivers of blood and mountains of twisted, burning steel. Decades later, when a surviving German Panzer commander was asked to describe the Eastern Front, he didn't talk about the cold. He didn't talk about the mud. He stared blankly at the wall, remembering the endless gray horizon of 1941, and simply said, "We ran out of shells long before they ran out of tanks." If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because the darkest tales of World War II are the ones they tried to bury.